More than 107,000 deaths from fentanyl just last year. About two-thirds involved synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. And those are real people. They are sons, they are daughters, they are brothers, sisters, friends, neighbors, loved ones. So joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. President Biden recently signed into law two pieces of her legislation trying to address this crisis. She is also a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a former CIA officer. Thank you for your time this morning. I saw your tweet last.
Thank you so much.
Of course. I saw your tweet last week about this and appreciate you getting up early to join us because I think this is not talked about nearly enough. And it is a crisis. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin. As we know, you have spent so much time with parents grieving the loss of their children. One of your pieces of legislation was actually named after a victim of this crisis, that is Summer Barrow. How can this actually change things when we're dealing with the deadliest drug epidemic in American history?
Well, it's important, and in the introduction, you spoke to it, is how potent fentanyl is. We know that in Virginia, more than 75% of overdoses were overdoses related to fentanyl in 2021. And so there's two elements to this. One is fighting the substance use disorder epidemic, helping those preventing drug addiction, helping those facing it, and then helping them throughout their long recovery. That's the Summer Barrow Prevention Treatment Recovery Act that you briefly mentioned. But we have to stop the fentanyl that's coming across our borders, so frequently entering the country at points of entry, right? And it's concealed, it's hidden in trucks and shipments coming across our southern border. But the challenge with fentanyl is because of its potency, it is able to be concealed relatively easily compared to other drugs that our DHS officials, that CBP have long been prepared for and able to interdict. So Securing America's Borders Against Fentanyl Act, which is the legislation that was signed into law late last year, does a couple really straightforward things. We know that if we're going to get at fentanyl, once it's in our country, we have to stop it from even coming in. So my law would require that DHS develop new technologies and strategies to detect fentanyl, recognizing the uniqueness of it, given how potent it is. Small quantities can go a long way, be incredibly deadly, but also easy to conceal. And so our call to DHS is to get serious about this. And in end of year funding, we appropriated dollars for them to take on this new action.
I'm glad you pointed out that much of this is crossing through legal ports of entry. I think the Washington Post did an extraordinary job in their deep dive in December of really getting into all of the failures on the national level from both parties. Not to mention, the DEA is understaffed by 800 people. They have 800 vacancies right now. And here's what one law enforcement official told the Washington Post. Law enforcement did the best it could. We can only do so much in Washington. They have been very slow to respond to this. And now we're at a confluence of paralysis. Do you agree that Washington has failed America largely in both parties on this crisis?
I think if we're talking about what Congress has done, there are so many more things that we have done. So I'm going to be an optimist about this. There's a lot of opportunity. But when it comes to immigration reform, when it comes to a broken immigration system that day after day creates flashpoints at the border, overstresses, an understaffed Border Patrol, yes, we have to do more. When it comes to the fact that many of our CBP officers are using antiquated equipment that cannot begin to find well-concealed drugs, particularly those in small quantities like fentanyl coming across the southern border, yes, we need to do more. We need to hold them to a higher standard. We need to make sure they have the funding to invest in new technologies. And we need to understand the reality of the threat. So much of what happens on Capitol Hill is we hear colleagues of mine in Congress just politicizing the issue. It is a complicated issue, but it only gets fixed when we're real about the threat. The threat is that large transnational criminal organizations, cartels, are trafficking drugs across our southern border through points of entry, and they are eluding and evading detection and ensuring that CBP officers have the ability to actually interdict drugs in the quantities that they're coming through. They do extraordinary work, but they need more support. And that's what this legislation is about, recognizing the reality of the threat and helping DHS and CBP have the actual equipment that they need on the ground in order to be able to do their job.
Yeah, something needs to change because it is, wiping away so many children in this country in particular. Congresswoman, I do want to turn to the classified documents found once again, more of them on Friday in President Biden's Delaware home. Just the day before that, on Thursday, addressing a question on this, he said there's no there, and he has no regrets. You're a former CIA officer, so you know what it means to handle classified documents. And I wonder if you're concerned about now 4 different discoveries of classified documents being held outside of where they should have been by this president.
Absolutely. I'm concerned by any appearance of classified documents outside of a secure, compartmented information facility known as a SCIF. I'm a former CIA officer. I used to handle classified documents every day. I used to collect the information that was then put into classified documents. So I know that the sources of those classified materials at times can be individuals who are risking their lives to provide valuable information to inform lawmakers, to inform the president, to inform our military and diplomatic leaders. And safeguarding those documents is about safeguarding our nation's secrets. And so I think it's important that the Attorney General has appointed a special counsel. I think that will be an important step in moving forward, answering the questions how these documents got out of secured spaces, how long they have been in uncontrolled spaces, and ideally ensure that this never, ever happens again. And so I think that that's an important step, and it's one that I'm glad the Attorney General is taking.
Finally, before you go, you have called our national debt a long-term threat to our economic stability and national security. The White House position is still that they will not negotiate at all with Republicans on the debt ceiling. Do you think that's a mistake by the White House not to negotiate at all?
I think they're 2 parallel conversations. I think the bigger threat than our existing debt is the catastrophic threat of a potential default on our nation's debt. The catastrophic national security implications, economic implications of defaulting on our nation's debt, of putting the American full faith and credit of the United States of America in danger. That is an absolute crisis of our own making if we go down that path. I think that we can have 2 dependent conversations. One, the United States of America must pay its debts. We need to be a reliable borrower on the international stage. And then separately, though in tandem, have the conversation about the financial choices that we're making, how much we are borrowing, who we are borrowing it from, and long-term plans to get our spending in a place where it is, insert your adjective, sustainable, less, or better than it is now.
Yeah.
But I think holding the full faith and credit hostage and potentially risking or being willing to risk a default on our nation's debt for negotiations, those things, that's just not a tenable threat that some of my Republican colleagues are making, though I do recognize that we should, and I would agree that we should be having long-term conversations about our nation's fiscal status.
Yeah, we must. It's been a quarter century since we've actually, the government has spent less than we've taken in, and we can't operate like that. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thanks very much.